There were many white students at the college, but Martin was happy to find that they were friendly towards him. In fact, they welcomed him. Martin realized that black people and white people did not have to hate each other. But how could he make white people in the South see this? He wanted to make them think like him, but he did not know how. He began to think seriously about this. In his last year at Crozer, Martin went to hear a talk about the Indian leader Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi and his followers had fought against the British in India, but they had used nonviolence, not guns, to get a free India. They had refused to pay money to the British government. They had sat in the road to stop the British Army. Thousands of them had been arrested for refusing to obey unfair laws. Gandhi thought that love was more powerful than hate. If you love your enemies, you can beat them, Gandhi had said. Martin was excited by Gandhi's words. Could black people in the South end segregation without violence? Martin continued his studies at Boston University. Now he was Dr. Martin Luther King. His family were very proud of him. But Martin was lonely in the North. He felt far from home, and he knew that his work was in the South. Then some friends introduced him to a young woman from the South called Coretta Scott. They fell in love and married in 1953. Soon they started a family. For the rest of Martin Luther King's life, he and Coretta worked together to fight segregation in the South. In 1954, the Kings moved back to the South. Martin became minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Once he was back in Alabama, Martin realized that things were beginning to change in the South. Black and white children were starting to go to the same schools. There were new laws against segregation. But white people in the South decided to fight against these laws. Clearly, trouble was coming in the South. And the trouble began in Martin Luther King's new home, Montgomery, Alabama. Chapter 6. The Montgomery Bus Boycott. Rosa Parks was a black woman who worked in a shop in Montgomery. Every day, she took the bus to and from her work. One day, in December 1955, Rosa Parks got on the bus to go home and sat in a seat at the front. There were 3 other black people sitting near her. More and more people got on the bus, and soon there were no more seats. White people had to stand. The driver stopped the bus and asked the black people at the front to give their seats to white people. 3 of them stood up, but Rosa Parks stayed in her seat. Rosa belonged to the NAACP, a black civil rights group, and she knew her rights. She refused to get up. "Why don't you stand up?" said the driver. "I don't think I should have to stand up," Rosa answered. "If you don't stand up, I'm going to call the police," said the driver. "You can do that," said Rosa. So the driver called the police, and Rosa Parks was arrested and put in prison. The arrest of Rosa Parks made many black people in Montgomery very angry. But it gave them a chance to protest against the policy of segregation on the buses. For years, the NAACP had wanted to take action against the city's bus company. Now they had a chance. But who could lead them? Martin Luther King had only been minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church for a year. but he was well known for his honesty. The NAACP asked King to meet them and decide what to do. It was time to end segregation on Montgomery's buses. They met in King's church. King said that black people should boycott the buses in Montgomery. "If we refuse to ride on the buses, the company is going to lose a lot of money," he said. In the end, they will have to end segregation. King agreed to lead the boycott. When the meeting finished, King was worried. He discussed his worries with Coretta, his wife. Will the bus boycott succeed? He wondered. Will black people obey the boycott? Most black people don't have cars, so how are they going to get to work? If people can't get to work, perhaps they will lose their jobs. Maybe the boycott will hurt black people more than it will hurt white people. How will that help black people? There were a lot of questions, and King and his wife talked for hours. Neither of them slept well that night. Next morning, King and Coretta got up and looked out the window. There was a bus stop in front of their house. They waited for a bus to come. At last, the first bus came, and it was empty. Then the second bus came, and it was empty too. It was the same all over Montgomery. Black people walked to work. Some of them walked 20 miles or stayed at home. Black taxi drivers drove people to work in their taxis for the same money that they paid on the bus. The boycott was working. The bus boycott lasted for more than a year. Many black people were arrested and put in prison, and King was one of them. Some white people were angry with King, and they thought he was dangerous. One night, someone left a bomb outside the King family home. It exploded, but luckily no one was hurt. The bus company was losing money, but it refused to change its policy. Shops in Montgomery were losing money too, because black people were not coming into town to shop. The owners of the shops wanted the boycott to end, but the bus company did not want the NAACP to win. The boycott leaders went to an Alabama judge. They said that segregation on buses was wrong. The Alabama judge did not agree with them, so they went to Washington to see the most important judges in the country. On the 13th of November, 1956, these judges said that segregation in buses was against the law. The Montgomery bus boycott had succeeded. Chapter 7. Big Trouble in Little Rock. The Montgomery bus boycott made Martin Luther King famous. People all over America began to talk about the young black minister who had organized it. But King knew that Montgomery was only the beginning. Black people had won their fight in Montgomery, but it was not the only fight that they had to win in the South. To win their civil rights, black people needed to organize themselves. In 1957, hundreds of Southern black church leaders met together to talk about what to do next. At the meeting, King said that black people had to work together to win their civil rights. The church leaders organized themselves into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Martin Luther King became the president of the SCLC. He told them that they had to join together to fight for the rights of black people in the South. King wrote a book, Stride Toward Freedom, to explain his ideas. In his book, he talked about the teachings of Gandhi. King believed that nonviolence was the only way to win the fight for black rights. In Montgomery, the boycott had been nonviolent. The police had beaten the protesters, and they had tried to break the boycott by violence, but the protesters had not fought back. They had no sticks or guns, and they had not fought violence with violence. They had just refused to let people treat them unfairly, and they had won because they were right, not because they were violent. There were many other things in the South that needed to change. Schools were segregated. White children went to all white schools. Black children went to all black schools. Although there were more black children than white children in the South, much more money was spent on white schools than on black schools. But in 1954, the law was changed. Now, it was against the law to have different schools for black children and white children. The new law said that all schools had to take both black children and white children. Change came slowly to the South. Many white people hated the new law, and in many southern states, they refused to obey it. Arkansas was one of these states. In the state capital, Little Rock, 9 black students tried to enter the Central High School at the start of the 1957-58 school year. Little Rock soon became one of the most famous places in the story of the fight for civil rights. On the 2nd of September, the night before the start of the new school year, the leader of the Arkansas government, Orville Forbes, ordered the National Guard to stand outside Central High School. He told them to stop any black students from entering the school because he was afraid of trouble from protesters. The school was closed. But a judge said that Forbes could not use the National Guard to do something that was against the law. On the 23rd of September, the Little Rock police took the 9 black students into Central High. A crowd of more than 1,000 white people tried to stop the black students from entering. The crowd rioted and attacked the police. The pictures of the riot were seen all over the world, and many Americans were shocked to see such ugly attacks in their own country. Next day, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, ordered the army to Little Rock. 1,000 soldiers stood in front of the crowd as the 9 black students entered Little Rock Central High School. Every morning, the 9 black children walked to the school, and every morning the soldiers protected them as they walked through crowds of angry whites. One of the Little Rock 9, Elizabeth Eckford, later talked about that walk past the angry crowd. I looked for a friendly face in the crowd. I saw a nice-looking old woman. She seemed to have a kind face. But when I smiled at her, she spat at me. Inside the school, things were different. Ernest Green, one of the 9 black students, remembered the friendly white students who helped him. I missed 3 weeks of school, so I was behind in my classwork. A couple of boys in my class gave me notes on the lessons that I'd missed. After seeing the crowd outside the school, I was really surprised by this. Chapter 8. A New Start? For black people in America, 1960 was an important year. King was busier than ever. He decided to move back to his father's church in Atlanta. He spent half of his time working in his church and the other half working for the SCLC. King's policy of nonviolent protest was becoming more popular. Soon Black people found a new way to protest: the sit-in. Restaurants in the South were still segregated. One day, in February 1960, 4 Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, walked into a shop called Woolworth's. There were hundreds of Woolworth shops across the country, and many had restaurants inside the shop. The students sat down at a table and politely asked for lunch. The waitress refused to take their order and told the students to go. But they refused to leave the restaurant. Instead, they began a sit-in. They sat at their tables and waited until the restaurant closed. Next day, some more students joined them. Then, some white students joined the sit-in too. The Greensboro students were arrested, but the sit-ins did not stop. Soon, there were sit-ins at restaurants all over the South. More white students from the North traveled to the South to join the sit-ins. In July 1960, Woolworth's finally agreed to let both Blacks and whites use their restaurants. Other big companies did the same. So once again, nonviolent protest had been successful in the battle for civil rights. Martin Luther King joined the sit-ins. When students held a sit-in at an Atlanta restaurant in October 1960, King stayed with them. He was arrested and put in prison. King was not sorry to go to prison. Like Gandhi, he believed that you should not obey a bad law. If the law is unfair, he argued, then it is right to break it. It is better not to obey a bad law than to obey it. If this means that you go to prison, then you have to accept that. King was not afraid of prison, but King's family and friends were afraid for him. They knew that King's life was in danger in prison. He had many enemies, and there were people who wanted to kill him. In the South in 1960, it was not difficult to kill a Black prisoner. Coretta King went to